academic grandfather, Josh Snodgrass. How are you?
I'm doing great. So nice to be here.
Well, thanks so much for sitting down with us today to talk about fieldwork. So we can just dive right in. So, how do you find your first fieldwork opportunity, and what advice do you have for students who are maybe looking to work outside of their institution?
Yeah, great question. I think it's fantastic you're doing this because it's such a difficult thing to do. So, I guess my first I'll talk about two really quickly. One was I started off kind of in the skeletal biology and forensics world. And so my first true work experience was in the former Yugoslavia, working in Croatia and Bosnia in 1996. And that was obviously a very different path from the human biology path that I'm in now. But it was definitely, in some ways, it was like kind of the experience that I've had in human biology. There's definitely some shared attributes. And I'm happy to talk more about that if you're interested. And then kind of the true HBA kind of human biology type work was field work in Siberia in 2001. And so I think for me, like the theme is being in the right place at the right time and being willing to do things, right? And being willing to do a crazy opportunity. So I was working with Bill Leonard, and Bill had been on my master's committee at University of Florida, but wasn't my advisor. And he kept on saying in classes that I took with him as a graduate student, oh, if anybody's interested in going to Siberia, this is a great place to work, because he'd worked there 3 field seasons back in the early 90s. And me and one other person, Mark Sorensen, were the only two who were like, this sounds fantastic. We want to do this. And everybody else is like, why would we go to Siberia? And I don't know. I just thought it was an amazing opportunity, both to work with Bill, also to do human biology field work, but then also just to have that opportunity to go somewhere that hardly anybody ever gets a chance to go to from the US or other parts of the world. So I think for me it was just kind of being willing to do that, and being open to the ideas, and then figuring out how to fit a project to it. So I think that flexibility and sort of willingness is definitely a big part in terms of like students finding field sites, especially if it's like not with an advisor at your particular university. I think it's all about networks. And I think that's also why I've so invested in Human Biology Association and AABA, is that I feel like I've benefited so much from those over the years and the networks, and see how that creates networks for other people. So I think, yeah, going to meetings, talking to people, expanding your networks is really important. And then I think being willing to put yourself out there and ask and let people know that you're interested in doing field work, and then also talk about the skills that you have that you would bring to that. And I think, that's really how it can happen, easiest, I think, when it's not a simple path from, you going to a field site that your advisor runs.
So, talking a little bit about budgeting and funding, how would you recommend students budget and also secure funding for fieldwork, especially when we're talking about international fieldwork or really long-term kind of projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing to think about is just flexibility, and that, like it can be really hard to get the money that you really want, right? The sort of, version of a field project that has everything, right? That's really difficult to get as a graduate student. And so I think being flexible and thoughtful about like, what are different ways that this could happen, right? Here's the $50,000 version. Here's the $20,000 version. Here's the $10,000 version. So, I mean, I think the theme that is always has emerged in my mind is very much that balance of sort of the practical, like pragmatic, how much money can I get? And then the science of like, what questions do I want to ask? And I think the reality is like, I mean, we really want it to be the science driving everything, but the reality is that the practical piece, is a big part of that. So figuring out how to scale it depending on the money you have, I think is a really important way to go into it. And then I think it's all about stacking grants, small and big, if at all possible, to do field work. Just to give you an example from my own dissertation research. So I applied to pretty much all the big ones, right? So like Leakey Foundation, NSF, Wennergren, but then also a lot of different smaller pots of money at Northwestern University. And I feel I was lucky at Northwestern because, as a private university, it had more access to those things. But certainly public universities do have, pots of money too. And, so I was able to attain a couple of the big one. So I had a Wennergren and I had a Leakey. I didn't have NSF funding as a graduate student as much as I tried for that. And that's another story that I'm happy to talk about if anybody's interested. But then also finding little pots of money from different places. I think I had money from Sigma Xi, then I had money from Northwestern. And so for me, it was just all like, okay, what are the field costs? But then also for a lot of it was the technical stuff in terms of I really wanted to do doubly labeled water to look at energy expenditure. And so at that point, it was super expensive. So I think it was just in isotope costs, it was $32,000, right? And so that was more than half of my entire field budget for 2 field seasons of dissertation work. So I think, going in, being optimistic, trying to, give yourself at least a couple of grant cycles to get money because you're probably not going to get it the first time, and then try to stack these and then be flexible about how it all plays out in terms of, okay, if I get this amount of money, I'll do this. If I get this other amount of money, I'll do a sort of different version of this.
So I'm thinking, what question could I ask and answer with $5?
Yes, exactly. But I mean, this is like the international field work is amazing, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity, and it's been wonderful to have graduate students for the last 20 years who have been doing international field work. But the vast majority of my field work these days is local. It's here in Eugene, and so it's totally different, and it is less expensive just because there isn't the travel issue. But I actually think in some ways like that experience is as satisfying, as exciting, as interesting, as hard as anything that I've experienced in other parts of the world. So I think, being flexible about, especially given this federal mess that we're in terms of like, it's going to be really, really, really hard for people to get big chunks of money in the way that even 5 years ago or 10 years ago people could. So like what are the local, field opportunities? And I think, that I would love to see more of a shift to doing work within the US and work within Europe, for example, or Latin America for Latin American researchers, that we can spend more time working in the communities that we live in. There's so many amazing questions that we can address here. So sort of thinking about, yeah, do I need to? Do I really want to go internationally? Or maybe that's something that I'll do 5 years from now or 10 years from now. So I think just the flexibility again is the key in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also kind of removing that stress of, having to secure such a large amount of funding if you are able to do that in your own backyard. So absolutely phenomenal advice. So let's say hypothetically somebody was able to secure their funding, they have everything in place. What steps can students take to prepare, whether it's academically, logistically, or even just mentally for their first field experience?
Yeah, that's all so important. I mean, I think field work is so challenging, and in some ways it kind of doesn't matter like whether that's locally or internationally. There's still kind of the same steps I think you need to take. And so obviously the academic preparation is key. And I think most everybody is already addressing that as part of their graduate program. I would say a piece to really be thoughtful about is the language piece, if that's something that makes sense for you. But I mean, I would urge people as much as possible to study the language that in the place that may be home, where that language is spoken most. And so, it could be speaking Spanish in Oregon or California, or it could be speaking Russian in Russia or whatever. And I think that's something that I certainly learned as I was going through this process. I was not 100% sure that I was ever able to go to Russia. And so I kind of had this like, I want to study Russian. I really want to invest in that. But does that make sense if this is not where I'm going to be able to go? And so I sort of did the half-ass version of that, to be honest. And so, I did not spend like years in classes learning Russian. I really wish I did. I spent a lot of time studying on my own and tried to as much as possible interact in Russian on my own, and that got easier with time. But I also felt it was kind of a missed opportunity. I mean, it was to be fair, it was a little more complicated in the sense that working with indigenous populations in Eastern Russia, where Russian was spoken, but also a lot of indigenous languages were spoken too. So things like interviews were not necessarily done in Russian. So I don't know. So it would be really hard to prepare. But I guess the message is for academic preparation, I would emphasize language skills. That would put that really high on the list for pretty much anybody. Like I would just really consider that. I think other stuff like in terms of just being ready to go into the field, that's obviously dependent on where you go, but I think really thinking this through in a lot of ways is useful, like especially in the really challenging places, like physically challenging places. And that may be like thinking through physical fitness, that may be thinking through all the possibilities that you're going to encounter there, just dealing with that issue, right? So, like, whatever, working in Russia, not only was about cold, as everybody thinks about talking about Siberia, right? But it was also like hauling a mass of equipment into labs, in the middle of nowhere that had no equipment in them. And so, like, I was just exhausted all the time, even though I was in really good shape because of carrying so much. And so I think just being really thoughtful and trying to get as much information as possible about what that field site is like and how best to fit yourself into that particular field work. So that's kind of the physical side. I would say the mental is probably the most important of all this. And like, and I could give examples, I could talk for days about this, starting with the field work, doing forensics work, for the UN, doing, working with mass graves and like no preparation for us as a field team as we went into that, right? It was the 1990s. I don't think there was an appreciation for mental health and mental health support at that time. I think it's a lot better. It's not great now, but it's certainly at least acknowledged as something really important. And so I think just being willing to recognize that these situations can be really hard to be in, that there's a lot of things that are going to take you out of your comfort zone and maybe super super challenging, and I would say it's very similar in international settings as local settings. I mean, I think some of the most challenging, emotionally challenging work that I've ever done is the homelessness work in Eugene right now. Like, that's just exhausting and so hard, and trying to stay present to be with people who are participants in our study, but also just people who are in that community who happen to be in the same place and may not be able to get into our study but are really interested, and that may be hard, or people who just come and want to talk to you about things, or people who are needing things that they're hoping we can provide. And so I think just figuring out like what is the situation likely going to be like, and you get this from talking to people, and then really preparing for how hard it can be, but then also planning for time after it, that you can decompress and you can talk to other people hopefully about the same experience that they're going through. And so I think that's something that we've really pushed with this homelessness and health project, is how do you at the end of the day, and how do you at like week to week, how do we interact as a team to support each other to talk through some of these hard situations? So yeah, I would say, yeah, language and mental health, attention to mental health are probably the two most important things that I would emphasize.
I think that's such a great point. Really, kind of the emotional aspect of field work seldom gets talked about. And having some time to decompress is so important. And it can sometimes feel really isolating, especially if you're in a community where that's not your primary language.
Yeah.
Really factoring that into your preparation can be so important. So our next question, sort of in the same vein, is what safety and ethical considerations should students keep in mind when they're planning their field work? And how do students balance practicing cultural sensitivity with striving for scientific inquiry?
Yeah, that's a great question, or a couple of great questions. I should also say I'm trying to finish a paper that's like our 20-year retrospective look at the Schwar project, so the Ecuador project that I've been involved with, sort of looking at that field site and talking through some of these issues. Because I think one of the issues is, we often see those scientific papers and they're very polished and they're very formulaic, and they talk about the data that's been collected and the results and whatever, but they don't really tell you that much about like what the field site conditions were like or what was required to actually collect that data. And I think going to talks or posters at conferences gives you a little bit more information, but still I feel like we don't get much information on this until you start to do it yourself or you start to talk to people who are involved in this. And then all of a sudden it's like more complicated, right? And so, I think preparing and sort of thinking about all of these issues that may seem, I don't know, they may seem minor, but they're actually really major, right? Because there's no way you can actually do the science without the logistics, the practical piece, the safety piece, and then the ethics too. I'll get to that in just a second. But I think just being really careful about like how do you get yourself into a position that's going to be safe and that you're going to have what you need and that your field team has what it needs to be safe. And I think that's so many details, right? And I think a student starting out who hasn't been to the field, right, is like this is hard to even consider. And so I think again, this is like asking people questions, having resources like this where people hear about this, having things in print that people can read or online that people can read. Because I mean, there's so many details, right? Like, safety in terms of where you choose to go and like, is this a place that you're going to have some serious political issues? Certainly the Siberia work has been that over the years for me. It's going to vary depending on places. And then like physical safety, like, and then, health in terms of like, do you have adequate vaccinations? Do you have like a plan in place if you have to leave quickly? Do you have a network of people who are paying attention to where you are and what you're doing on a daily basis? And I feel like in some ways now it's easier, right, in terms of communication than it was, say, 25 years ago when I was first starting out in terms of going to the field. Like we couldn't really communicate. I was not able to talk to people except for when I was in one of the major cities or the major city. So I think staying connected is really important so that people know where you are and what's going on, so that if there is a need for getting out or getting money or getting something, that you've got people who are standing by ready to help you with that. So I think it's really just figuring out what are all those different things that I need to think about, and that you kind of in some ways have to a little bit obsessively think about those things and take them as seriously as you take the science. And also the flexibility again, to be willing to like, okay, I said I was going to, work with 300 people. I'm not able to because of all these different reasons. I have to then make decisions about what I can and can't do based on the conditions, right? And I think all of us who have done field work in our careers realize that like what ends up in the papers that come out of the field site is very different than what goes into the grant proposal, right? And I've actually seen very few times where like especially with like an NSF GRFP or something like that translates into papers in exactly the same sort of one-to-one way. So I think what you realize is that field work, wherever that field work is going to be challenging, and there's always going to be times where it's always going to be different than what you anticipate, even for the most seasoned field workers. I would say that the ethics piece is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about, and I'm at this point in my career where I'm really liking to be thinking about this, trying to drive the field forward, trying to talk about these issues in print. But I think this is really such an important thing, and I think we, especially coming from a place like the U.S., we're often sort of entitled and feel like we have not only the opportunity, but we should be supported in these field environments. And again, field could be in the homeless community in Oregon, or it could be in Russia or somewhere else. And I think we have to realize that first and foremost, like, we can only do field work when people want us there. And so we should be thinking about it not just like, okay, we'll come in and do our thing and people are okay with it. And so they sign off and we're able to be there. But we should be thinking about it instead as like, we should be investing as much as possible. Like, what do people want from us? What's the reason why they let us into their communities? And how can we act responsibly on a day-to-day basis? How can we do this, during the life cycle of our field work? But then also, how do we think about this long term? And I think, just emphasizing the ethics of this, emphasizing the community engagement, I think is really important. So if people haven't had a chance to check it out, you should definitely, this is my little promotional thing, is check out a paper that we recently had published in AJHB. Madeline Getz is the first author on that. And she was an undergrad of mine at Oregon, and she's now a grad student at Arizona State. And it's actually 8 of us co-authors sort of grappling with these issues about ethics of field work, both in human biology and global health. So I think in some ways we're starting to see a little bit of like what goes on under the surface of like what actually happens in the field, and then how should we think about varying sites and kind of different communities and sort of how we adjust what we do, but based on sort of a set of ethical principles.
Absolutely phenomenal piece. And yes, we'll definitely be putting it in the show notes and highlighting it on all of our AJHB socials because the social media manager.
Yes, exactly.
But I think that, a lot of us get so excited as students to be able to go into the field. It's like the culmination of our grad school experience isn't just getting that degree, but it is to be able to
Yep.
say you went to the field, and the safety side is so incredibly important. And I was fortunate enough to go to the field last year, and I went with an all-male team. And I was so lucky that my colleagues were very protective, very professional, wonderful people. But I will say my experience as a woman was completely different from theirs. And so I think, doing that background research and knowing a little bit about what you're going into culturally, politically, et cetera, as you were saying. And I think a lot of us do trust our advisors and the PIs. And of course, these people have that background knowledge, but, make sure you're doing your own research as well.
Absolutely. And I would add to that kind of it's a bit ableist too, right? The way we think about like field sites, like people kind of need to be like fit and healthy, or that's the expectation. And so like, how do we think about like reasonable ways to like that we can humanely treat different people and sort of set them up for success in different areas, right? So I think just knowing yourself, right, and what your limits are, what your needs are, I think is really important. And then finding a way to connect with an advisor or a field site, person who's running a field site who actually respects that and is happy to work with you on that, and then figure out like how to make that work for a particular place.
Maybe that can be part 2 of this webinar, and we can do like the fitness routine how to's, like how to get in shape, run 10
Yes.
miles a day, lift weights.
Yeah, it's really crazy. I mean, just like that preparation for certain places, especially given the physical demands or, cold or heat or altitude or parasites or whatever it is, like it's a lot.
The humidity. I know I have very curly hair, and in Samoa, my hair was just bigger and bigger every day. So kind of taking this a step further, we talk about like the mental side and how challenging field work is, but what are some specific challenges that you have faced, or maybe your team or your students have faced, and how did you overcome them?
Oh wow, yeah, we should have that as like, the third part of this is like talking about that in detail. I just feel like it's all challenges, right? And I think that and some of them are like super super hard, right? And they can play out in such unexpected ways. And I think the sort of mindset to go into this is there's going to be challenges, and how do I set myself up so that I can respond to those challenges when they arise? Because it's not like they're not going to arise. It's just what ones in particular. I would say some are, totally unexpected and not necessarily bad things. So just to give an example with Siberia, one of the times we got there, like this was work in 2000, and I think this was 2009. when we did this field season, and we'd been there a number of times before, but it was the first time with a major NSF grant that was looking at, like hormonal changes by seasonality and things like that. And we got there to the field site after 3 days of traveling, right, without a break, right, kind of the overnight, and then in a truck for 6 hours to a field site, get there. And the whole field season, we planned to work with 300 people, and there were 450 people standing there waiting to be part of this, right? So it was great in terms of, wow, lots of people who want to participate, but now I'm making decisions about how I turn people away and the consequences of those, rather than how do I slowly recruit people, right? So I think, those, some of those unexpected things can be great, but also present a series of problems. I think, some of the stuff that's been the hardest to deal with, and including stuff that I've literally been dealing with this morning, just is like visas and permissions to go, and making sure that everybody is on the same page. I think the Russia work was really, really, really challenging for me, in that it was just so out of my control about like when things got and how things got approved. And so I never knew one field season to the next whether I would ever be able to go back, right? There were these sort of larger geopolitical things going on, and then some sort of more local things at the level of the Republic and sort of the scientific community that just always were difficult to navigate. And so there were times where like all of a sudden, like things got shut down, and and I wasn't able to go. And or things like, I had one time where in 2007, it looked like there was no way I was going to get my visa approved, and I'd spent like literally 6 months trying to do this, and finally came to the conclusion that there was just no way, and I had to call it off. And then all of a sudden I got a call saying, okay, the visa's been approved, let's leave tomorrow. And so I'm leaving for 2 months, and I was at a place in my life where I could do that, right? I'm not in that place anymore, but I, jumped at the opportunity to go for 2 months. And but it was crazy. I mean, it was like a movie, like just grabbing stuff in the lab and sort of sweeping it into a suitcase, as I'm like running to the airport. And I barely made my flight, and then I barely made my next flight, and then and eventually I finally made it all the way to Russia. But it was just, that kind of challenge, like in terms of not having full control over it, is so hard to navigate. And so I think, I guess I tend to, for whatever reason, be pretty good at navigating the unpredictability, but I know that certain people struggle a lot with that. And so sort of thinking through, like, what situation do you really want to get yourself into? Like, is this really the right decision, or is this something that's hard, but you can navigate it? So I think just recognizing that there's so many moving pieces, that it relies, field sites and field seasons require so many people, that kind of just having a willingness to accept that you don't have control. And so, like, are you okay with that? And if you are, how do you navigate it then, time to time? So I'm sure I have lots of other examples that I could share in terms of when things like shit really hit the fan. I'm not sure that's the most useful, because it's just like pain and suffering, and then like deciding to start work somewhere else. But there's like all the degrees of sort of things going wrong.
So,
I will say that one of the main reasons why the Schwarp, Health and Life History Project was started was, part of it was meeting Larry Sugiyama and seeing this opportunity to create this project. But part of it was my willingness to invest in that, because I was absolutely 100% convinced I was never going to go back to Russia because of just the politics of things. And then after that, we had another like number of field seasons in Russia. And so I ended up like having, the field opportunities and directing field projects sort of stacked in a way that I never anticipated. And people were like, why are you working in Ecuador and Siberia? I was like, that's not what I planned. Right. It was just like sort of hedging my bets a little bit, and then all of a sudden both started working. Right. So I think like when you start hearing these stories about how people have navigated it, you realize like it's just chaotic. Or maybe that's just my life.
I think everyone experiences some level of chaos in the field. I learned to drive an ATV this past field season and crashed into a ditch in front of one of the participants. So I think field work really is like one of those ultimate tests of flexibility and
Yeah.
also learning to laugh at yourself a little bit
Yes.
because you
Yes.
will have embarrassing moments.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think if any HPA students want, personal stories, feel free to reach out to any one of us. I'm sure we all have a ton to share.
And
Um,
that's a good part of meetings is going to the meetings and actually having these conversations.
yeah, it's always nice to see everyone and kind of all realize that we're learning as we go.
Yes.
So our next question is about what strategies or what are the best ways to document field work
Mm.
experiences, and how do you save that for later research or publishing or even career development?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I am not as good at this as I should. Like I've always tried, like I should say, I always carry like a little notebook. I rarely have used this except for like financially. I find sometimes like carrying that around, it becomes essential to sort of like record how you're spending money, especially if you're like getting money for like per diem or something like that, and you're in some place for quite a while. Tracking that gets hard. So I tend to be pretty good about that. But in terms of like actually writing down my field experiences, I really wish I was better at this. And I see, friends of mine or colleagues of mine that do a much better job of this. I think for me, what's actually worked, besides trying to like keep it in my head and thinking about it, helping it solidify in my head, is like writing emails, to family members, like, because I've got a few family members who, like my mom and my aunt, who kind of like, want to know what I'm doing in detail, but are not. I don't see them often enough to sit down for like 5 days and tell stories or something like that. So I will often, like when I get to a place where I'm waiting in an airport to leave, or I've got some downtime, that I actually will write kind of like long emails that actually do go through a lot of what has happened during the field season. And so I think that's become over the years just a good way to document things. And I've actually gone back and looked at these in the past to sort of see like, oh wow, that's not how I remember it, but this is how I wrote this message. So I must have like just be remembering it in a different way. So I think documenting things, I think, is really important. I really hope as a field, I really want us to have more of that documentation or ability to sort of talk about these things that we do. I want more opportunities for that. I don't want to have our field and our papers be so curated and censored that you don't know the details about some of the things that like what is required to do the field work. So I think more and more having that available on whatever websites or in appendices of papers or things like that, I think can be really useful for not only documenting it for us as a field team, but also sharing that information.